Albert wasn't a lonely man. Not exactly. His days had a comfortable rhythm. The rough scratch of the newspaper delivered just before dawn, the same pot of strong tea steeped until it was nearly black, and mornings spent puttering in his overgrown garden. The weeds always won, but the act of tending, that was what mattered. Meals were simple. Leftovers reheated, a sandwich if his appetite was small. Evenings with a radio and old westerns flickering on the telly. His favorite armchair, worn to the perfect shape of his body. Since Mary had passed, there was a quiet clinging to the house, the kind that even the familiar chatter of the newscasters failed to chase away. He told himself this wasn't loneliness, just the natural order of things. He missed her, of course. Missed their easy banter and how she could read his moods without him uttering a word. But life was meant to be lived, then to end, wasn't it? One sunny afternoon, a knock at the door startled him. He wasn't prone to visitors, certainly not at such an odd hour, halfway between lunch and supper. On the steps stood a young woman, not much more than a girl, really. Her fiery red hair tumbled out from under a knit cap, and her backpack looked bigger than she was. "I'm lost," she admitted, flashing a sheepish grin that did something funny to the quiet air around Albert. "Oakwood campsite. That's what I'm looking for. But I must have gone the wrong way." Her voice was bright and a touch breathless, the sort someone raised in a city might have. Albert had spent his whole life in this small town, knew every back road and worn footpath. The campsite was clear in the other direction. Before he could think of the right words, another part of him, some rusty instinct he hadn't felt in years, stirred. "Well, it's getting dark. You're welcome to stay the night. Got a spare room, and you don't look the sort to do me harm." Even as he said it, the words shocked him. Common sense whispered that it was foolishness, inviting a stranger in. But some instinct in him, long dormant, whispered a different word: opportunity. With a jolt, he realized he couldn't quite remember the last time his house had an unexpected visitor. The girl, Jessica, she said her name was already beaming at him, all relief and gratitude. Her whirlwind energy filled his house the moment she stepped inside. It wasn't just the overflowing backpack or the trail of mismatched socks she left as she followed him to the guest room. It was her. The way she filled the space with stories about places he'd only glimpsed on documentaries. Bustling night markets in Thailand. The vast stillness of the Australian outback. Jessica's phone chirped constantly, a stream of messages or maybe videos sent to faraway friends. At first, the noise set his teeth on edge, but as the afternoon wore on, he found himself strangely drawn in, asking about a temple she'd mentioned or a funny-looking fruit she showed him a picture of. Part of him wanted to retreat, to find a quiet corner and reassert his routine. Yet another part, the part he'd nearly forgotten existed, whispered that just a bit more disruption might not be the worst thing. Jessica wouldn't let him retreat. With a determined gleam in her eye, she'd insisted he show her the waterfall she'd heard about in town. At first, it was an obligation, something to busy himself with until she could be on her way. But then he laughed, genuinely laughed, at her terrible attempt to mimic the bird's song they heard. Before he knew it, a whole afternoon had slipped by, leaving a lightness in its wake. Small-town gossip traveled fast. Soon, well-meaning Mrs. Bennet was cornering him at the grocer's, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "Heard you've got a young lady staying with you, Albert. My, how things change." He sputtered something about helping a lost traveler. But if he was honest, Mrs. Bennet's words sparked a fluttery something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not exactly romantic, but not unpleasant either. The shift was subtle at first. While working with Jessica to clear out his attic, he found a box of Mary's old recipe books, a burst of warmth amidst the dust. The clutter was overwhelming, but Jessica, in between tales of bungee jumping in New Zealand or bartering for trinkets at a Bangkok market, organized things with surprising efficiency. Things felt lighter somehow. There were gaps now, spaces on the crammed shelves. Albert found the room they left was less suffocating than he'd expected. One evening, as the last of the summer sun bulled through the kitchen window, he overheard Jessica on the phone. Her voice was hushed and worried. Money problems, it seemed, and a desperate need for a place to stay. Suspicion rose, a knot in his gut. His practical mind screamed warnings, replaying the town gossip now tinged with a sharper tone. Mary's voice echoed, "You always were too trusting, Albert." But then he remembered Jessica smiling, the way she sang along to his father's old records. He couldn't forget that kindness in her eyes. Without really deciding, he knocked on her door and cleared his throat. "Miss Jessica," he said, his voice sounding gruff even to himself. "Seems like it might be helpful for us both if you stayed a while longer. That attic of mine isn't going to clear itself." Instead of confrontation, he surprised them both by offering her a short-term job, payment in exchange for more help with decluttering. Their days took on a new rhythm. They'd find forgotten treasures, an old pocket watch of his father's, a chipped teapot that sparked a story about Mary's disastrous first attempt at baking. Jessica's eyes lit up with every find, urging him to tell the tales behind the objects. His town started noticing, too. First, it was the fresh haircut, prompted by Jessica's horrified gasp at his unruly mop. Then the smile that reached his eyes when Mrs. Bennet teased him again about his house guest. One afternoon, deep in the garage, they unearthed his old photo albums. "Get a load of those flares," Jessica burst out laughing. Albert, a younger version of himself, stared back, the surprisingly wild haircut hidden under a floppy hat. "You were quite the looker back then, Albert," she teased. He couldn't help but grin. Time with Jessica had chipped away at the settled quiet he still treasured. His routine remained, but now there was space in it for the unexpected. A lot of that unexpected seemed to involve technology. First, it was Jessica teaching him how to search online for specific gardening tips. "You see, Albert, it's like a giant encyclopedia, but way faster," she explained. Then came the afternoon she convinced him to try ordering groceries online. "It's like magic, Albert, I swear." Jessica grinned, perched on the kitchen stool and furiously tapping away at his old laptop. "You just pick what you want, click a button, and they deliver it right to your door." Albert eyed the screen with deep suspicion. Seems like a lot of fuss to avoid going to the store. Besides, he added, unable to resist a bit of teasing, "What will I do with all my spare time?" Jessica simply patted his arm. "Trust me, this will open up a whole new world for you." An hour later, he had to admit it was oddly satisfying, adding items to a virtual cart. Sure, the website was confusing, and he fumbled a few times, but Jessica patiently guided him through. When they finally hit checkout, a surge of something akin to triumph bubbled up in him. 2 days later, when a cheerful delivery man brought boxes right to his kitchen, he almost whooped with delight as he unpacked fresh tomatoes, bread that hadn't been squashed in his bag, and even a few treats he might not have bought in person. Albert had to concede, maybe this modern world wasn't so bad after all. "See?" Jessica beamed from the doorway. her hands dusted with flour from her latest baking experiment. "I told you it was magic." And then it was time for her to go. She found a job at the diner and a tiny apartment above an old bookstore. Nothing fancy, but her smile held a hope he hadn't seen since Mary. He wished her well, the words thick in his throat, and knew it wasn't quite goodbye. The day she left, he helped her move her few belongings. As they loaded the last box into her friend's battered car, something small and shiny caught his eye. It was the photo from their attic expedition, him in those ridiculous flares, Mary beside him, both of them caught mid-laugh. Jessica held it up, not a picture anymore, but nestled in a simple wooden frame she must have scrounged from somewhere. "A thank you," she said, her voice soft, "for reminding me it's okay to start over." She hesitated, a smile playing on her lips, "for showing me even old houses can have hidden treasures." As he shut the door behind her, the emptiness of his house hidden sharper this time, yet different. The photo, once buried, was meant to be displayed. It wasn't just a memory anymore, but a testament to the unexpected joy that had bloomed within his walls. A reminder that even an old dog, as Mary used to tease, could learn a few new tricks. He found himself drawn to Mary's old recipe book. He smiled, remembering how Jessica's eyes had lit up as she discovered the recipe for Mary's famous apple crumble. In that moment, it felt wrong to keep all of Mary's warmth for himself. Not when it could light someone else's new beginning. On impulse, he wrapped the book carefully. The next day, he found himself at Jessica's new apartment above the bookstore. Her surprised laugh when she opened the door chased away his hesitation. "This is for you," he said, handing her the package. "Figured you might need some inspiration for your new kitchen." Her eyes scanned the faded cover, and a wide smile lit her face. "Mary's recipes. Albert, you shouldn't have." "It's no use to me sitting on the shelf," he said, a touch of warmth softening his gruffness. "Besides," he added with a hint of mischief, "I never could master that apple crumble." A week later, flyers for a community walking group fluttered on the library notice board. He hesitated, hand hovering over the number. Could he do this? Walk with strangers, make idle chatter? The old Albert would have retreated, found an excuse, but a flicker of Jessica's determined smile nudged him. What did he have to lose? With a deep breath, he dialed the number. Turns out, his town was full of surprises as friendly voices welcomed him to the group. He might have even cracked a joke with Mrs. Bennet the next day at the market. Albert wasn't a changed man, not overnight, but he wasn't quite the same man who'd opened the door to a lost girl that sunny afternoon either. He still savored his quiet mornings. His garden still grew more weeds than flowers. Yet within the comfortable rhythm of his days, there was a new melody weaving its way in. He wasn't lonely, not like before, just open. And really, wasn't that what life was all about?